The forest had never felt so silent. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that gnawed at the edges of your thoughts, whispering that something was wrong. He moved carefully through the undergrowth, his boots pressing into damp earth, breath slow, measured. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet leaves, but beneath it, something else lingered, something metallic, sharp, blood. Then he saw her. At first, she seemed like a trick of the moonlight, pale, shimmering, not quite real. But when his eyes adjusted, the truth hit him like a punch to the chest. A girl. No, not a girl. Something else. She was curled at the base of a massive tree, her body trembling, her silver skin catching faint light through the leaves. Thick chains coiled around her wrists and ankles, biting into her flesh. She was breathing, barely. Her head lolled forward, silver-white strands of hair slipping over her face. He took a step forward, and her eyes snapped open. They glowed a colour he had no name for, shifting between deep violet and something impossibly bright, like a dying star. She didn't scream, didn't speak. She only watched him, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. His heart pounded. Who had done this? What had done this? Her lips parted slightly, and though no sound came, her expression was clear. Fear, desperation, a silent plea. Help me. Logic told him to turn around, to pretend he never saw her. There was no normal explanation for this, but logic had nothing to do with what he did next. He dropped to his knees beside her. Up close, she was even stranger. Her skin wasn't just pale. It had a sheen, almost like liquid metal, shifting as she breathed. The chains binding her weren't ordinary iron either. They were something denser, something unnatural, humming faintly when he touched them. "Who did this to you?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She flinched, the movement so slight he almost missed it. No answer. "Okay," he murmured, swallowing. "Okay, I'm going to get these off." His fingers traced the chains, searching for a latch, a weakness, anything. The links were ice cold, even through his gloves. His pocket knife was useless against them, barely making a scratch. He cursed under his breath. She stirred then, shifting enough for him to see her arms properly. The chains had cut into her wrists. There were bruises, dark and ugly against her shimmering skin. His jaw tightened. Whoever had done this hadn't cared if she suffered. He reached down and, without fully knowing why, pressed a hand to one of the links. The moment his skin made contact, a strange heat surged through his palm. A vibration. Almost alive. The metal pulsed. Once, twice, then cracked. He jerked back, stunned. The chain split apart like brittle glass, crumbling to the ground. The girl inhaled sharply. Neither of them moved for a long second. Then, like something breaking free of an invisible weight, she surged forward. Not at him, not in fear, but as if suddenly released from gravity itself. The remaining chain shattered in rapid succession, disintegrating into dust. She collapsed forward, her hands catching against the ground, panting. He started to reach for her, but she was already pushing herself up, unsteady, but determined. When she looked at him again, her glowing eyes were wide, unreadable. She was still afraid, but not of him. She took a single trembling step back, then another. "Wait," he said, rising to his feet. "You—" She turned and ran, vanished into the trees without a sound, leaving only broken chains and the ghost of her presence behind. He stood there, heart still hammering, trying to understand what had just happened. The wind rustled the leaves. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. The forest remained silent. The only proof that she had ever been there was the lingering warmth in his hand. The knock was too soft for a stranger. At first he thought he'd imagined it. The kind of sound that lived in the space between waking and dreaming. So faint it could have been the wind shifting the trees. But then it came again. 3 delicate raps against the wood. Insistent. Waiting. He hesitated. No one came to his house unannounced. His place sat on the edge of town, where the land stretched wide and dark, the nearest neighbour a mile away. He hadn't told anyone what happened in the woods the night before, had barely processed it himself. Yet as he moved toward the door, an instinct deeper than logic coiled tight in his chest. He knew who it was. Still, when he opened the door, the sight of her stole his breath. She stood in the moonlight, small and still, the same alien girl he had freed. Her silver skin gleamed softly, reflecting the faint glow of his porch light. She was dressed the same as before, if it could even be called clothing. A thin, dark material clinging to her form, torn in places. Her white silver hair hung over her shoulders, slightly damp. But it was her eyes, those glowing, shifting pools of colour, that held him captive. She wasn't trembling anymore. She wasn't afraid. She was watching. In her hands she clutched something small, pulsing with a soft, impossible light. It shifted colour as it moved, like liquid opal trapped in glass. She raised it slightly, as if presenting it to him. "This is for you," she said. The words were delicate, careful. Her voice had a strange lilt, like someone learning a language they weren't meant to speak. But there was no hesitation. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. "What is it?" His voice was steady. His pulse wasn't. She didn't answer right away. The wind stirred, lifting strands of her hair, carrying the faintest scent of something unfamiliar, something like the air before a storm. Then she said, "You took something from me?" His stomach twisted. "The chains," she clarified. "They were not just metal. They were more." She took a step forward, her bare feet silent against the wooden porch. "Now, I must give something back." It was an exchange then, a balance. He'd freed her, and this was her answer. He exhaled slowly. He should have been afraid, should have slammed the door, or called someone, or done something other than stand there, feeling the weight of her presence like gravity had shifted in her direction. But instead he asked, "Who were they?" "The ones who had chained her." Her gaze flickered, just slightly. "Not who," she said softly. "What?" That sent a chill through him. Before he could press further, she lifted the object again. "Please," she said, "take it." The glow pulsed, almost in time with his heartbeat. He didn't know if it was wise, didn't know if accepting it meant sealing some unknown fate. But he had already made his choice the night before. His fingers closed around it. The moment he touched it, warmth spread through his palm. Gentle at first, then deeper. It wasn't just heat. It was alive. A pulse. A thread of something that wasn't him, but was suddenly part of him, winding into his bones, his breath, his thoughts. He sucked in a sharp breath. His vision blurred at the edges. A flood of something unseen pressed against the corners of his mind. A sensation not quite pain, not quite pleasure, but something entirely new. And through it all, she stood before him, waiting, watching. Then just as quickly. As it started, the warmth receded, settling into his skin like an ember buried in ash. He opened his eyes. The object was gone. No, not gone. It was inside him. He staggered back a step, heart slamming against his ribs. "What?" "You will understand," she said, her voice quieter now, "with time." His breathing was uneven, his body still tingling from whatever had just happened. But when he looked at her again, she wasn't afraid. And that, more than anything, terrified him, because it meant he should be. He swallowed, forcing himself steady. "Why me?" This time she didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him as though she saw something in him he didn't, something he couldn't. Then, with a final unreadable glance, she stepped backward off the porch. The night swallowed her whole. He didn't chase after her because for the second time in 2 nights he knew she would come back. The object was gone, but its presence lingered. He could feel it, settled beneath his skin, woven into him like something that had always been there but had only just woken up. His body felt the same, but not. A hum ran through his veins, faint but undeniable, like an unheard frequency vibrating at the edges of his awareness. He barely slept that night. Every time his eyes closed, his mind dragged him into something strange. Not quite dreams, not quite memories. Flashes of colour, places he didn't recognize, stars spread out in patterns that made no sense, and always a presence, watching, waiting. By morning, the sensation hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deeper. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, half expecting to find something different, but there was only himself. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, the faint creases of a man who had spent the night wrestling with questions that had no answers. The knock at the door the night before had changed everything. And the worst part? He wanted to know more. The day passed in a haze of normalcy that felt anything but. He went to work, drank coffee, talked to people who had no idea that something inside him had shifted in a way that could never be undone. Every sound was too sharp, every movement too fast. Colours seemed richer, deeper. He could hear conversations happening across the room as clearly as if they were whispered in his ear. It wasn't overwhelming, not yet, but it was there, and it wasn't stopping. By the time he got home, the sun was already sinking below the trees, stretching shadows long across the ground. The air was still, but something in it felt charged, like the moment before a storm. And then he felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, just presence. He turned before she spoke. The alien girl stood at the tree line, half hidden in the dim light. She wasn't cautious this time. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was expecting him. He exhaled slowly, stepping off the porch. "I figured you'd be back. You are different now." It wasn't a question. He crossed his arms. "You think?" Her gaze flickered, scanning him, and something about it made his skin prickle, like she wasn't just looking at him, but through him, measuring something he couldn't see. "It has begun," she murmured. The weight of those words settled in his chest. "What has begun?" For a moment she didn't answer. Then, with a slow, deliberate step forward, she said, "You felt it." He didn't bother denying it. "What is it?" Her expression was unreadable. "The first part of you waking up." A chill ran down his spine. He didn't want to ask the next question, but he had to. "What does that mean?" She hesitated, just slightly, and that scared him more than anything else. Then she said, "They will come now." His pulse kicked. "Who?" She glanced past him, toward the house. The wind stirred, lifting strands of her pale hair. "Not who," she said, echoing her words from the night before. "What?" A breath of silence stretched between them. Then, softer, she added, "You should leave this place." He let out a short, humourless laugh. "Just like that?" She tilted her head slightly. "You must." His jaw tightened. "I don't even know what I'm running from." She took another step forward, close enough now that he could see the faint glow pulsing beneath her skin. "You are not running," she said. "You are choosing." He shook his head. "Choosing what?" Her lips parted slightly, as if to answer. And then she froze. Her head snapped to the side, gaze locking on something beyond the trees. He turned instinctively, scanning the darkness. But he saw nothing, heard nothing. The forest was still, too still. And then a shift. Not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling. Like something vast and unseen had just turned its attention toward them. A slow, suffocating pressure crawled up his spine, settling deep in his gut. His breath hitched. The girl's fingers twitched at her sides, her jaw clenched. Then, without looking back at him, she whispered, "They are already here." The night was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the heavy, unnatural kind. The kind that pressed in from all sides, making the world feel smaller, like something vast and unseen had wrapped itself around the edges of reality. He felt it settle in his bones before he saw anything. A pressure, a presence. The alien girl stood perfectly still, her silver skin almost luminous in the dark. Her glowing eyes were locked on the trees beyond his house, unblinking, unreadable. But her body, he could see the tension in it now, a coiled, waiting stillness. "They are here," she had said, and now, as the air thickened around them, he knew she hadn't been wrong. His fingers curled into fists. "What do they want?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Me." A cold wave passed through him. "They're the ones who—" "Yes." Something rustled in the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was too slow, too deliberate. Something was moving just beyond the tree line, not walking, not running, gliding. His pulse pounded in his ears. How many? The girl inhaled carefully, closing her eyes for half a second before opening them again. 3. He scanned the darkness, but the trees were thick, the shadows shifting too easily. 3. It didn't sound like much, but somehow the number didn't comfort him. His voice was tight when he asked, "What do they look like?" A pause. Then she said simply, "You do not want to see them." That should have scared him more, but what scared him most was the way she said it, soft but certain, like she knew something he couldn't understand until it was too late. His muscles tensed. "Then what do we do?" For the first time since she had arrived at his door, she hesitated. Not from uncertainty, something else. Then finally she said, "You cannot fight them." She shook her head. "I can run." His jaw clenched. "Then we run." She shook her head. "I can run." Her gaze flickered toward him. "You cannot." Something in her voice made his stomach drop, a realization. They weren't here for him, but they had noticed him. She took a slow step back toward the trees. "If I go to them, they will leave you alone." His gut twisted. "That's your plan?" "Just hand yourself over." Her expression remained unreadable, but something in her eyes shifted, something almost gentle. "It is the only way." A shadow shifted at the tree line. His breath caught. They were close now, too close. And she was going to let them take her. Number. His hand shot out before he could think, fingers wrapping around her wrist. Her skin was warm, smooth, almost weightless. She looked up at him, surprised. "Not a chance," he said. For the first time since he had met her, she blinked in open disbelief. "You don't understand," she murmured. "If I run, they will hunt. They will not stop. Not until I am—" A sharp crack split the air. Not thunder, not a branch snapping. Something deeper, heavier, like the air itself had torn. The girl tensed. Then the lights in his house flickered. For a fraction of a second the porch light dimmed, then flared too bright, burning hot and white, buzzing like something alive. The ground beneath his feet vibrated, just slightly, like something massive had shifted beneath the soil. His grip on her wrist tightened. What the hell was that? She exhaled, barely above a whisper. "They have decided." And then the trees moved. Not the way trees should, not the way anything should. The shadows twisted, bending where there was no wind, no force, no reason. The space between the branches stretched, warping like liquid, like oil, like something ancient and wrong. And from that darkness, eyes, not human, not animal, wrong, cold, empty, endless. And they were looking directly at him. The air was breaking. That was the only way he could describe it, the way space itself seemed to twist and stretch, the way the darkness inside the trees moved, like something alive. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. His mind fought against it, trying to make sense of something that had no business existing in the world. He understood. But those eyes, they were real, cold, hollow, watching. The alien girl stood rigid beside him, her silver skin catching the flickering porchlight, her glowing eyes locked onto the shifting void between the trees. "They were not supposed to notice you," she whispered. A chill crawled up his spine. "Well, they sure as hell have now." The pressure in the air deepened, sinking into his bones. A sound, low, vibrating, filled the space between them. It wasn't quite a voice, not words, but something close. His ears rang, his vision blurred for half a second, and then, without warning, the girl grabbed his hand. It was the first time she had touched him by choice. "We run," she said, and this time he didn't argue. They bolted. His feet pounded against the dirt, breath sharp in his chest. The girl moved fast, too fast, like gravity barely touched her. Her body cut through the night as if the air parted for her. He struggled to keep up, but she didn't let go of his hand. Behind them, the trees groaned. He risked a glance back and regretted it instantly. The shadows were spilling, like ink, like liquid, like something seeping through the cracks of the world. The space they had stood in seconds ago wasn't just dark now. It was gone, erased, as if it had never been there at all. His heart slammed against his ribs. "Where are we going?" She didn't answer. She yanked him to the left, deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees with effortless precision. His legs burned, lungs fighting for air, but adrenaline kept him moving. A whisper brushed against his mind. Not a sound, not a voice, a feeling, like something enormous was reaching for him, like fingers slipping into his thoughts. The girl skidded to a stop. He nearly crashed into her. "What?" She spun, hands gripping both sides of his face before he could finish. And suddenly, silence. The pressure vanished. The whisper disappeared. The world snapped back into focus. His pulse pounded against his skin. He staggered back, blinking. "What the hell was that?" She exhaled sharply. "They were pulling you in." His stomach dropped. "Into what?" A pause. Then quietly she said, "The space between—" He didn't know what that meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know, but something was clear now. This wasn't just about her anymore. They had seen him, and whatever they were, whatever they wanted, they weren't going to stop. The forest was suffocating, not from heat, not from lack of air, but from something else, something unseen pressing in from all sides, warping the space around them. The trees loomed taller than they should, their shadows stretching too far. The air was thick, humming with a presence he couldn't shake. He and the alien girl had stopped running, but his body still pulsed with adrenaline. His breath came sharp, burning in his throat. He pressed a hand against a tree, trying to steady himself. But the bark felt strange beneath his fingers. Too smooth, too cold. Something was wrong with this place. The girl stood beside him, her silver skin catching faint slivers of moonlight that cut through the canopy. Her eyes, always unreadable, always glowing, were narrowed, scanning the forest like she was listening for something beyond his range. He swallowed hard. "Did we lose them?" A pause, then, "No." His stomach tightened, his hands curled into fists. "Then what are they waiting for?" Her gaze flickered toward him. A mistake. The weight of that single word settled deep inside him. Something moved in the trees. Not a rustle, not an animal, something else. A shifting of space, a flicker of movement that didn't belong. His muscles locked. "Tell me you saw that." She nodded slow. "They are closing in." His pulse pounded. "Then we keep moving." He turned, but her hand caught his wrist, firm, unyielding. He froze. "We cannot run any more," she said softly. His jaw clenched. "So what?" "We just stand here." Her glowing eyes locked onto his. "You do not understand." A sharp chill crawled up his spine. "They are not hunting us," she whispered. "They are hunting you." "Mister." His voice was barely above a whisper. You touch the gift. The gift. That strange pulsing object she had given him. The thing that had seeped into him. Changed something inside him. He felt it now, more than ever. The humming in his bones. The way his senses stretched beyond what should have been possible. They know what you are becoming, she murmured, his breath hitched. And what am I becoming? She hesitated. Something they fear. The words hit harder than he expected. Fear. Those things in the dark, the ones who had chased her, the ones twisting reality around them. They were afraid of him. The thought should have reassured him. It didn't, because fear made things desperate, and desperate things didn't stop. A slow, sickening vibration crawled up his spine. Then the trees moved, not from wind, not from force. They bent, twisted, their outlines shuddering like a mirage, like a reflection rippling across water. The girl tensed. They are forcing the shift. He had no idea what that meant, but he didn't need to ask, because a second later, the darkness split, a crack in space itself, and from that crack, something stepped through. The world broke open. It didn't crack like glass. It didn't shatter like stone. It peeled. A gash of darkness ripped through the space between the trees, a wound in reality itself. The air tore, bending inward, dragging with it a cold so deep it gnawed at his bones. It was wrong. Every instinct in his body screamed. Wrong, and then something stepped through. Not walked, not emerged, stepped, like it had always been there, waiting, just beyond sight, pressing against the fabric of reality, until it found a way through. It was tall, too tall, its form shifting at the edges, refusing to hold a single shape. A living shadow, its surface slick like oil, yet impossibly empty. And those eyes, they weren't eyes, they were holes, gaps in space, endless and yawning, set deep within a face that wasn't a face at all. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The pressure it radiated said everything. It was here, for him. The alien girl stepped in front of him, her body tense, glowing eyes locked onto the thing in the clearing. They should not have come this far, she murmured. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay upright. What do they want? Her fingers curled at her sides, to erase what has begun. His heart pounded. You mean me? A slow nod. They do not understand you, and what they do not understand. They destroy. The thing tilted its head, its hollow gaze fixating on him. A wave of cold washed through his mind, like something reaching inside, searching. His vision tilted, his thoughts fractured. He was standing in the clearing. Number. He was somewhere else, a place without time, without air, without sound, a void, and in that void, others. They watched him from the edges, shapes barely visible against the crushing emptiness. They weren't like the girl. They weren't like anything. But he understood them. He felt their will, their purpose, their certainty that he did not belong. He was an anomaly, a mistake, and mistakes had to be erased. A voice. Not a sound, but a presence pressed against his mind. You are not meant to exist. Pain flared behind his eyes. Number. This wasn't real. The forest was real. The cold dirt beneath his feet was real. The girl standing between him and the thing in the clearing, she was real, and he refused to be erased. A sharp, searing heat bloomed inside his chest. The gift. The thing the alien girl had given him. The strange, pulsing object. It wasn't just in his hands anymore, it was in him. And now, it answered. Light erupted from his skin, not bright, not blinding, deep. A glow that wasn't just light, but something more. Something that pulsed with impossible weight. His body felt heavier and lighter all at once, like he was stretching beyond himself, becoming bigger than what he had been. The void around him shuddered, and for the first time, the things watching hesitated. The alien girl turned, burned, her glowing eyes widening. She saw it, what he was becoming. "You are shifting," she whispered. The void crackled. The thing in the clearing recoiled, its hollow gaze narrowing. "No!" It lunged, but this time he didn't run. His fingers lifted, instinct driving him now, the new energy inside him coiling, expanding, reaching. And then he pushed. A shockwave ripped through the clearing, a pulse of raw force colliding with the thing before him. The darkness buckled, space itself bending as the void twisted, folding inward. And then it was gone. The tear in reality sealed shut with a final, sickening snap, leaving only silence in its wake. His knees buckled. His breath came fast and uneven. He felt altered, as if something fundamental had shifted inside him. The alien girl caught his arm, steadying him. Her expression was unreadable. "They will not come back," she said. He looked at her, still dazed. "How do you know?" A pause, then, "They are afraid." Something cold settled in his stomach. She wasn't wrong. Those things, those impossible things that had hunted her. Then him. They had feared what he was becoming. He let out a slow breath, his hand still tingling from the energy that had surged through him. "What happens now?" he asked. She studied him for a long moment. Then quietly she said, "You will need to choose." He frowned. "Choose what?" A ghost of something, almost like sadness, flickered across her face. "Who you will be." And as the night settled back into its quiet hum, the world around him feeling too still, too normal after everything that had just happened, he realized she was right. His life, his future, it wasn't his own anymore.